Okay, now we're going to be talking about the submediant and tonic expansions. If you already watched a previous lecture, you learned about how the subdominant and the dominant can be used in a tonic expansion. So now we're just going to talk about the sixth scale degree, the chord built on the sixth scale degree, and how that's typically used in music. So the submediant usage, there's a few ways to look at it. You can think of it as a one chord moving to a six chord. Oftentimes what we'll do is we'll just indicate the voice leading. So we'll say there's a fifth above the bass, it's G, and then it just moves to a sixth above the bass. So you notice that there's no difference in the way that this is voiced. It's just in one example we indicate an actual sixth chord, and in another example we indicate the voice leading. So our reasoning for choosing a Roman numeral over indicating the voice leading would have to do with how we actually perceive that sixth chord. Do we hear it as its own chord in its own right and as a functional part of the tonic expansion or any expansion? Or do we hear it as simply a voice leading technique where a one chord is simply the fifth is moving up to the sixth and then maybe coming back down again to the fifth? So it really depends on your perception. Either one of these would be correct in most contexts, but if you wrote it like this, you'd be indicating that it's more of a voice leading technique than an actual harmony. And you could argue that when the sixth chord is in first inversion, it doesn't have the quality of the sixth chord since only one note is changing. So the submediant can be used to smooth out voice leading, and it really just allows the one chord to move smoothly to a sixth chord. It also prevents parallel fifths that would occur from 1 to 6. We can either label it as 1 to 5, 6 or 1 to 6, 6. So labeling a progression as 1 to 6, 6, it's not technically wrong. It's very important to point that out, but the voice leading symbols would be more accurate when the sixth chord occurs only briefly. Now, here's another issue in music theory. Oftentimes, theorists some of them will identify a sixth chord as a predominant. Others will not. So it really depends on whether or not you hear it as a predominant chord going to the 5. And in truth, the sixth chord very rarely moves directly to 5. It acts more as a predominant to the predominant. So it's a preparation to the predominant. So for that reason, I never identify the sixth chord as a predominant unless it's specifically serving that role and that function. And when you start analyzing music, you'll start to see that the sixth chord generally comes before a 4 chord or a 2 chord. It rarely replaces the 4 or the 2. Unlike the 2 chord that can replace the 4 chord as a predominant, we don't generally see the 6 chord working in that function. So for me and many other theorists, it doesn't make sense to label the 6 as a predominant. Surely it does help prepare the predominant, but that's not the same thing as actually moving to the dominant. Okay, so in moving from 1 to 6, this is a typical chord progression. 1, 6, this chord goes to the 4 chord, which is our predominant, and then our predominant goes to the dominant. Again, this is another reason why I just don't classify the 6 chord as a predominant, because it's not going directly to the 5 chord. And typically when you do have two predominants, sort of in a predominant expansion, you'll typically have the stronger chord followed by its weaker version. So since the 4 chord can be substituted with a 2 chord, you might have a 1, 6, a 4 chord, which is strong, going to a 2 chord, which is a little bit weaker, and then you'll hit the 5 chord. But we never go from a 2 chord into a 4 chord because it just doesn't make a lot of sense that way. So if we had the 6 chord, if we classified that as a predominant, then we have a weaker chord sort of intensifying the stronger chord, and it doesn't work that way. Typically, your stronger chords are there to really establish that predominant area or your tonal area, and then you'll have weaker chords to push the music along. If you start out with a weak chord, that's going to be a very soft beginning to an area. So typically don't use that 6 chord as a predominant unless it goes directly from 6 to 5, which is pretty uncommon in classical music at least. So when you have the 6 chord, when the 5 chord comes before it, in the middle of a phrase, we would call that a deceptive resolution. If you have 5 moving to 6 directly, and it comes at the end of a phrase, like what we have, let's say in measure 5, you had this 5 chord, it's a cadential 6/4, but you have your 5 chord here, and then let's say measure 6 was a 6 chord, we would call that a deceptive cadence. So the cadence is reserved only for when it actually ends a phrase. Otherwise, if you see the 5/6 progression, it's just a deceptive resolution. We'll talk more about this later when we actually talk about deceptive cadences, but it kind of fits in with our discussion of the 1 and the 6 chord movement right now. Just know that if you don't see a 1/6, maybe you see a 5/6, it's typically going to be called a deceptive resolution or a deceptive cadence. So you label your 6 with the tonic substitute in the second layer. So if we look at this here, this 6 chord would be labeled as a tonic substitute, because where does our cadential 6/4 normally go? We have our 1/6/4 chord on the downbeat, and then on a weaker beat you get your 5/7 chord, and then it would typically want to resolve to 1. But here we have a 6 chord, so it's substituting for the tonic. So you could label this as TS, and that would indicate that it's just serving the function of a 1 chord. And this is actually an example of something called an embedded cadence, which we'll talk about more in a moment. It's actually an embedded phrase model in this case. So let's talk a little bit about the voice leading when moving from 1 to 6. If we look at our first measure, we have a 1 chord right here moving to a 6 chord. Notice how you're going to be holding the common tones. So in this case, the E holds over and the C holds over because these two tones are common with the 6 chord. Notice scale degree 5, it moves to 6. So we're looking for the G, it moves up to the A. So 5 does move to 6. The bass tends to go down a third from 1 to scale degree 6. So in the key of C, scale degree 6 is A. So scale degree 1 here moves down to 6. So all of this has been fulfilled so far. We also double the root of the 6 chord. So in this case, you've got your A here and your A here. This is pretty typical when they're in root position. If they're in inversion, which we don't have any examples of here that I can see, you would double the third of the 6 chord. And we'll talk more about this when we actually get to this, but when we talk about the deceptive cadence. But typically, if you don't double that third, you've got a few problems that result. And they typically result in parallel fifths or parallel octaves. And we'll get into more detail on that when I actually talk about the deceptive progressions and cadences. So if we look at measures 1 and 3, you can see that both measure 1 and measure 3 follow this convention. Here, scale degree 5 moves up to 6, common tones are held over, bass comes down a third. As long as you do that, you shouldn't make any mistakes when writing from 1 to your 6. So let's talk a little bit about an embedded phrase model. I kind of call this a phrase inception because it's a phrase within a phrase. So here you have your tonic area. It's expanded all the way here until the predominant. And then we get our dominant, and then we get our tonic closure. So this would be your typical basic phrase model that uses an expanded predominant to make it just a little bit more interesting. So if you use a PDDT within the tonic area, like we see here, there's a predominant, a dominant, and a tonic. Here's another predominant, dominant, and then this is a tonic substitute. Then we can view these as a tonic expansion, but we can also view these as embedded phrase models. Because if you listen to this, it doesn't sound like the phrase ends here, and it doesn't sound like the phrase ends here. But these are sort of embedded phrase models that do allow the piece to have more structure and more forward motion. So the way we would write this in analysis is just underneath the predominant, we put it in parentheses. We write PD, D, and then T with an end parentheses to indicate that's the end of the embedded phrase model. Here, we write PD, D, and then TS because this is actually a tonic substitute. And this is a commonly used piece when talking about the embedded phrase model because it's very easy to show where your embedded phrase model actually is. So you might see this in a composition. Another way to write this would be to break this bar line and write PDDT. You'd still put it in parentheses, but you'd make it part of this tonic expansion. Either way is fine. This way just clearly shows the multiple layers that are involved. So we can think of it in terms of the Roman numeral progression. We can think of it in terms of the overarching phrase model. And we can think of it in terms of the embedded phrase model. It just allows us to go back and forth between the various layers. So we can see how to perform this and where the important parts are in the composition. Now notice, the 6 is not included as part of the predominant. 6 is not included. The 6 is included here as a tonic substitute. And that's really more how the 6 will function in music. This is a way to expand the 1 chord because they're so similar. It's just one note that's changing. So it makes it really easy. So just like with the 4 chord, only one note changes between the 4 and the 2, so we can use the 2 as a tonic substitute. With the 5 chord, between the 5 and the leading tone chord, only one note changes, so the leading tone chord can also substitute as a 5 chord. You have to have some real similarities between the 2 chords so that they can function as substitutes. That is one reason why the 6th chord often is called a predominant by some theorists, because it does share 2 chord tones with the 4 chord, but it doesn't share 2 chord tones with the 2 chord. So because of that, it becomes slightly problematic to really view the 6 as a true predominant substitute. So the final thing, prolonging the final tonic area. So here we effectively have a cadence. Let's assume this is the end of a phrase. I know it says measure number 1, but pretend that's not measure 1. Pretend this is the end of a phrase. And we have this cadential 6/4. We don't have the octave, but it comes down to 7/5/3. And then we have a phrase ending here conclusively on the 1 chord. We've intensified the dominant, and we've created a powerful resolution into this 1 chord. And then we have this 5/1/5/1. This is a way to actually expand the tonic area, the tonic closure. And so you'd write this as the dominant area. You'd write this as a T, and then you just draw a line all the way to the end to indicate that the tonic closure has been expanded. You can also use a 4/1 cadence, a plagal cadence, which we'll talk about fairly shortly in some upcoming lectures. So just know that the tonic closure can be expanded. It's typically when you hear that timpani, bum, 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 and then we finally get the close of the piece.